that is in the news a lot these days, which is the trade war between the US and China. We know that President Trump really likes tariffs. He tells us all the time on Twitter. Not only does he like it, he also has implemented lots and lots of tariffs over the last 13 months, actually. And so I just want to ask this question: are tariffs on Chinese imports a good idea? And obviously, as economists, you probably will agree with me that they are not, in general, a good idea. However, I wanted to just think a little bit, give the administration the benefit of the doubt, and maybe just think of, is there any way to explain what is going on right now? So that's what I want to just think about a little bit. Because we know in international trade theory there are some very specific circumstances under which a tariff is in fact a good idea. So do they apply to what's going on right now? And this is just why they're not a good idea. If we live in a perfect world where all countries are small, there are no market failures, and all markets are competitive, no, they're not a good idea. There's going to be a deadweight loss. We're not allocating our resources efficiently. But in national income accounting identity, we know that when we do reduce imports, we also reduce exports. So we should not do it in that world. But we also know that we don't live in that world. We live in a world where there are all kinds of market failures. So we want to maybe just try to incorporate that a little bit. When I look at what the administration has said, Britain, there are really 6 arguments for why the tariffs are taking place. The first one is, of course, and President Trump has been saying this for many years actually, we need to protect the US industries and jobs. The second one is that trade deficits are just bad. We need safeguard tariffs, has been used, national security, unfair trade practices, and then finally, the last argument that's being used right now is that tariffs is a negotiation tactic. Let me just go through these just quickly in turn. It is, of course, true that any policy, whether it is a trade policy or domestic policy, will create both winners and losers. This is not really an economic argument, therefore, because whenever you do some policy, there will be some groups that win and some groups that lose, but it's very hard to pick which one. Should we, who are you going to pick as being the winner? And it is, of course, possible that people working in the coal industry, in the steel industry, in the aluminum industry, in the washing machine industry, in the solar panel industry, maybe they deserve some protection for some reason, but as an economist, we cannot answer that question. That's a political question, and I can't really answer it. But the more relevant question is, why should we protect some people and not others? And those are the ones I want to just focus a little bit on. This one is the easy one. Are trade deficits bad? No, they're not. So it is true that we have a massive bilateral trade deficit with China. It's actually higher in 2018 than it was in 2017, which says something, because all through 2018 we're putting tariffs on imports, which, if you believe, if Trump was right, then that would have reduced the trade deficit. I just read a couple of days ago, Janet Yellen, the former Fed chair, arguing that there is no real meaning to bilateral trade deficits, and I think all of us will agree with that. And it's not an appropriate objective of policy, so we shouldn't even think about it. Nevertheless, that is something that Donald Trump has certainly emphasized a lot. So let me just go into the 3 battles that has been fought over imports over the last 13 months. It started in January 2018. The decision was made earlier, but they implemented it in January 2018 when we put tariffs on washing machines and solar components, solar panels. It's worth knowing that this was justified legally to satisfy the World Trade Organization's rules as safeguard tariffs, which means that the administration made an argument that all these imports of washing machines and solar panels are hurting substantially the production of domestic producers of washing machines and solar panels. Whirlpool in Benton Harbor was the one who asked for those protection. It feels to me that these kind of things are probably more about protecting certain industry and jobs than maybe a good idea in terms of what's good for the country. Nevertheless, we could try to make an argument like this if we have a market failure. One could try to make an argument that the production of washing machines, maybe the use of washing machines, are creating some positive externality, and therefore it's very important to have washing machine production in the US. Although I think it would be a bit of a stretch to make that argument. In fact, it's probably more true that when you put a tariff on solar panels, you're making solar panels more expensive, and therefore consumers will not buy as many or install as many, and therefore they will use fossil fuels instead. So there's probably a negative externality, if anything. So I would say that the solar panels had probably both a distortionary cost because of the tariff, and there's a negative externality associated with not having solar panels being installed. So we actually made the country and the world worse off. So this would not be, in my opinion, a very good argument. What about national security? And that was the second battle. The argument was that there's a lot of excess capacity in terms of steel and aluminum in the world. Therefore, the price of steel and aluminum are very low, and therefore US producers are going out of business. They cannot compete. And then the national security argument is, of course, that if we don't produce steel and aluminum, how can we possibly fight a war? Because we couldn't produce, weapons. And therefore, we need to protect the steel and aluminum industry, and that's what they did. 25% tariffs on steel, 10% on aluminum. It's not a very good argument, though. Although, it's a valid, in fact, it is one of only 3 valid arguments for protectionism. But I think they really diluted that argument when they put the tariffs on all our allies as well. Canada, European countries, South Korea. And that made the argument very weak. Also, steel and aluminum, there are lots of metals that are very important for modern warfare, and they did not put any tariffs on those rare metals and so forth. So again, going very quickly here, a weak argument. So now we're getting into the meat of the problem and the trade war, which is that China might be using unfair trade practices, especially when it comes to intellectual property, technology transfer, and any kind of innovation policies. When it comes down to it, this is probably the main concern that people have in the US. It's also the main concern that economists would have when it comes to China and trading with China. It is true that China has policies that force firms that want to invest in China to sign agreements that transfer some of the technology to the domestic partners. It's also true that there has been cases of intellectual property theft in China. So this is a real concern, but it didn't really come to a point until in 2015, China adopted their Made in China 2025 framework, where they, and this was probably a mistake, where they explicitly said that we are going to overtake the US in terms of advanced manufacturing. Clearly, that put the US on edge. And instead of realizing that having a wealthy China could be good for the US in terms of our economy, ever since then they have been pushing against China, trying to bring China down. Is there any way we could contain China? And the import tariffs have then been a way to to contain China, especially in the Made in China 2025 policy. It hasn't been working very well, of course, because China has retaliated. Whenever we put a tariff on their goods, they have retaliated in putting tariffs on our goods. But there are some languages, you know, in the Made in China, they have toned it down a little bit. So there is some movement. Just in the last couple of days, of course, Larry Kudlow came out saying that we're having fantastic talks and they're going really, really well. And China is getting, you know, reducing their tariffs on U.S. soybeans and beef. I'm not as optimistic. Of course, they raised the tariffs on soybeans and beef, and now they're just bringing them back to what they were before, so it's not really a win. Nevertheless, these are some interesting things, and they make sense. In economics, they make sense. Advanced manufacturing probably has some positive externalities associated. There's probably some technology spillovers that we can take advantage of if we have advanced manufacturing. China has been incredibly successful in producing and exporting basic consumer goods, clothing, shoes, basic consumer electronics, and that has brought them to middle income status. But if they want to become a high income country, they probably have to transition to advanced manufacturing. So it's going to be very hard for us to convince them not to do that, because it is in fact a good argument for China to pursue these policies. Is it a good argument for the US to try to stop China from doing it? Well, if you're right that advanced manufacturing has positive externalities, if those industries are being transferred to China, that will hurt America. So there is some reason for why we should perhaps try to work with or contain China in some way. And that gets us to the third argument, which is the big one here, which is that tariffs are just a negotiating tactic. Everything we've done so far was just part of a big plan. It didn't start out as a big plan, but now it is. Of course, there are some significant costs associated with the plan, which is that, you know, initially, this trade war is making everybody worse off. But in terms of negotiation, the argument is that these temporary costs will be outweighed by the permanent benefit that we'll get when China changes their behavior. The question then is, will China change their behavior? It seems unlikely to me that they will significantly change their behavior. Of course, everything they've done so far has been to retaliate, so that says that they will not do what we want them to do. They have, you know, just moved a little bit, but probably just to make sure that the administration stays happy and does not increase their tariffs, which worked last Sunday when they postponed March 1, today's increase. There is some change in the Made in China 2025 policies, but not substantial, just in language, not in anything. And given that this is so important for the Chinese industrial policy, I don't think they will ever change that policy. I don't think there's anything the US can do, especially since Chinese exports that goes to the US is actually less than 20% of total Chinese exports. We are actually not a very big market, or it's not the major market for Chinese export. Since we're out of time, I'm just going to stop right here. But obviously it is too early to tell. They're still negotiating as we speak right now. But I think this is an interesting topic to think about in terms of understanding what's going on in the news right now. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take just one question, one short question.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, as a Friedmanite, I say if the Chinese government wants to rob their taxpayers to give us things below cost, I'm fine with it. But is there a better way for the government to go after the Chinese stealing of American property, intellectual property, other than a tariff? What would be the best thing?
I agree with you. Usually when they subsidize their goods, we should be happy about it. But that breaks down when there are positive externalities with the domestic production. So that's the only time when that would not hold. I would say that if you have a problem, you should always address it at its source. So if what we're really facing is an investment problem, we should solve it with investment policies or policies on investment. So I think the best way would probably be to, instead of restricting or putting tariffs on Chinese imports, maybe restricting Chinese investment in the US might make them realize what's going on in a better or more efficient way. That would be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you.